In the north transept of the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, on a wall painted in the first years of the 14th century, one angel appears to be falling out of the sky. Its body twists completely around its own axis, spine arched, wings thrown backward in a spiral that almost no painter working in the 1200s had attempted, and few painters working in the 1400s would risk. The angel is one of 10 hovering above the dead body of Christ in the scene known as the Lamentation, and conservators who have spent careers studying the 1,000 square meters of fresco inside this small brick chapel keep returning to this single figure, because by the physical logic of the medium in which it was made, it should not have been possible. Fresco does not forgive correction. The plaster sets within hours, and once it hardens, a mistake in foreshortening cannot be scraped away and repainted the way an error in oil paint can be glazed over and buried beneath a later layer. Whoever painted this angel had to see the twisting body complete before the brush touched the wall, and had to be right on the first attempt. The painter's name, according to the earliest surviving documentation, was Giotto di Bondone. The year usually given for the completion of the chapel is 1305, 721 years before the writing of this sentence, close enough to 700 that the question every visitor eventually asks under this ceiling still applies without much adjustment. How was this painted 700 years ago? If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The chapel takes its name from the arena that once stood on this ground, the ruins of a Roman amphitheater absorbed over the centuries into the fabric of the city, and it was Enrico Scrovegni, a young and extraordinarily wealthy Paduan nobleman, who purchased the site around the year 1300 and began building a private chapel attached to a palace he was constructing beside it. Enrico's fortune came from his father, Reginaldo Scrovegni, whose name appears in a poem written within Enrico's own lifetime. Dante Alighieri, composing the Inferno in the first 2 decades of the 14th century, placed Reginaldo among the usurers in the 7th circle of hell, seated beneath a rain of fire with a purse marked by the family's coat of arms hanging from his neck, an azure and pregnant sow, a play on the family name, mocked in the text for the sin that built the fortune his son inherited. Whether Enrico commissioned his chapel primarily out of piety, out of a documented medieval legal tradition that allowed a usurer's heir to make restitution through public charitable works, or out of a more personal wish to answer what a great Florentine poet had already written about his family, is a question the surviving records do not settle, and probably never will. What the records do show is a private chapel dedicated to the Annunciation of the Virgin, consecrated in the spring of 1305, its interior walls covered floor to ceiling with a single unified fresco program depicting the life of the Virgin, the life of Christ, and on the entrance wall facing the altar, a vast Last Judgment in which Enrico Scrovegni himself appears kneeling, offering a model of his own chapel to the Virgin and 2 attendant figures, positioned not among the damned figures crowded into the lower corner of hell, but among the blessed. No contract for the fresco commission survives, which is common for the period, and the attribution to Giotto rests on a combination of stylistic consistency with his documented work elsewhere and an early written reference. A chronicler from Ferrara, writing within a decade or 2 of the chapel's completion, named Giotto as the painter of the Paduan chapel, and by the middle of the same century, the attribution was treated as settled fact by writers compiling the first histories of Italian painting. Padua itself, in the years around 1300, was one of the wealthiest and most intellectually active cities in northern Italy, home to a university founded some decades earlier that had already begun to draw scholars in law and medicine from across Europe, and home to a merchant and banking class whose fortunes, like the Scrovegni families, often rested on financial practices the Church officially condemned. Usury, broadly defined in medieval canon law as charging any interest at all on a loan, was treated as a serious sin, closely tied in theological writing to the sin of greed, and, because it was seen as profiting from time itself, a resource belonging to God alone, considered a kind of theft against the divine order. And yet the same cities that condemned usury from the pulpit depended on the credit those usurers extended to function, to finance trade, building projects, wars, and the ordinary machinery of a growing urban economy. Enrico Scrovegni inherited a fortune built on exactly that contradiction, and he was not alone among wealthy Italians of his generation in commissioning religious art and architecture that could be read, at least in part, as an attempt to answer for it. What makes his chapel unusual is not the impulse but the scale and coherence of the answer, a single building whose every wall, from the illusionistic virtues at eye level to the twisting angels above the Lamentation to Enrico's own kneeling portrait beneath the Last Judgment, was organized around one sustained argument about sin, grief, judgment, and the possibility of a fortune's stain being answered for through devotion. A persistent tradition, first recorded by Giovanni Boccaccio decades after the chapel's completion, and repeated by later writers though never confirmed by any contemporary document, holds that Dante himself, during a period of exile from Florence that brought him through the Veneto, visited Padua while Giotto was still at work on the frescoes, and the two men, poet and painter, spent time in each other's company. The story cannot be verified, and no contemporary document confirms it. Documented history does place the poet who condemned Enrico's father to the seventh circle of hell and the painter who gave Enrico's chapel its most persuasive argument for redemption as exact contemporaries, working in the same region, within the same decade, on two entirely different accounts of what the Scrovegni name would come to mean. What those early writers could describe in words, later restorers would eventually be able to measure. Giotto's contemporaries and immediate predecessors, trained largely in a Byzantine-derived tradition transmitted through Italian workshops, painted saints and holy figures according to fixed patterns. Frontal poses, gold backgrounds signifying a sacred space set outside ordinary time rather than a physical one. Drapery rendered in repeating linear folds copied from established models rather than observed from life. Faces built from a template rather than from any single sitter. The fixed patterns served a coherent visual theology, built to communicate the eternal and unchanging nature of the sacred, rather than to depict a believable moment happening in physical space. What Giotto did inside the Scrovegni Chapel breaks from that theology so completely, and so early, that historians of art have spent more than a century arguing over how much credit belongs to Giotto alone, and how much belongs to a broader shift already underway in central Italian painting during the final decades of the 1200s. Vasari, writing in the middle of the 1500s, tells a well-known story about Giotto's origins. A shepherd boy, discovered by the established painter Cimabue while sketching a sheep on a flat stone with a sharpened rock, taken into Cimabue's workshop, and within a generation surpassing his teacher so completely that later commentators would credit him with pulling Italian painting out of what they called the maniera greca, the Greek manner. The anecdote cannot be verified and was almost certainly embellished for effect, a common feature of biographical writing from that period. But the underlying claim, that painting changed direction abruptly within Giotto's working life, is not simply later myth-making. It shows up in the physical evidence of the Paduan chapel itself, in choices no earlier workshop trained purely in the Byzantine manner would have made. Along the lowest register of the chapel walls, below the narrative scenes of Christ and the Virgin, Giotto painted a continuous band of single-color figures rendered to look like carved stone relief rather than flat painted image, an illusion technique that required him to model form using only shifts of a single pigment's value from dark to light, with no color to help the eye read volume. 7 such figures line one wall, embodying virtues: prudence, fortitude, temperance, justice, faith, charity, hope, and 7 line the opposite wall in mirrored positions embodying the vices that oppose them: folly, inconstancy, anger, injustice, infidelity, envy, despair. A visitor, walking the length of the chapel, passes beneath this argument in stone-colored paint before ever reaching the altar, presented in a technique so convincingly sculptural that the eye alone struggles to confirm the wall is flat. A useful comparison sits only a few hundred kilometers away, in Siena, where the painter Giotto di Bondone was completing his own monumental altarpiece, the Maesta, in almost exactly the same years Giotto was finishing the Scrovegni Chapel. Duccio's work, for all its color and refinement, remains firmly inside the pictorial world Giotto was breaking away from. Figures arranged in tiers according to rank rather than physical logic, drapery built from elegant, repeating linear patterns rather than the fall of cloth over a believable body, faces individualized in expression but still set against flat gold rather than any suggestion of physical space. Both painters were working at the height of their skill, for wealthy and demanding patrons, in the same decade, drawing on overlapping traditions. The distance between what Duccio produced in Siena and what Giotto produced in Padua, measured in these specific terms, physical weight, foreshortening, spatial coherence, is not a matter of one painter being more talented than the other in any general sense. It is a measure of how differently each one answered the same inherited question about what a painted holy figure needs to look like in order to carry religious meaning, and it is why art historians treat the Scrovegni Chapel less as one accomplished example among many from its period, and more as a hinge, a point after which one answer to that question would gradually become the dominant one across the next 2 centuries of Italian painting. The narrative scenes above the dado were not painted in a single continuous surface, but in sections, a working method dictated entirely by the chemistry of true fresco. Pigment applied to fresh, wet lime plaster bonds permanently with the wall as the plaster cures, producing a surface that will not flake or fade for centuries, but the plaster must be laid fresh each day in an area small enough for the painter to finish before it dries. Conservators call each of these daily sections a giornata, and the boundaries between them remain faintly visible under close and raking light, forming a kind of map of the painter's working process, pressed permanently into the wall itself. During the major conservation campaign completed in 2002, led by Italian restoration authorities under the direction of the art historian Giuseppe Basile, technicians spent years photographing and measuring the chapel's surfaces at close range, tracing the giornate across the full fresco cycle, and comparing the boundaries between daily work sections to the compositions they contain. What they found reinforced something scholars had suspected from visual inspection alone. Across several hundred individual giornates spanning the full chapel, Giotto's compositions show remarkably few of the corrections, called pentimenti, that typically mark a painter working out a composition as he goes. Figures land where the geometry of the surrounding scene requires them to land. Foreshortened bodies, including the falling angel above the lamentation, resolve correctly across giornata boundaries that a less confident painter would have used as an opportunity to adjust the plan already committed to plaster. Among the details the 2002 restoration examined most closely was the color of the sky itself. Every narrative scene in the chapel, more than 36 framed panels arranged across the walls, shares the same deep, saturated blue background, a color that required Giotto's workshop to use true ultramarine, a pigment ground from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone mined at the time almost exclusively in a single remote region of what is now Afghanistan and shipped west along trade routes through Venice, close enough to Padua to matter, but expensive enough that its use across an entire chapel ceiling and every narrative scene represented a serious financial commitment, not a minor decorative choice. Cheaper blue pigments existed. Azurite, ground from a copper mineral available much closer to home, could produce a similar color at a fraction of the cost, and many painters of the period reserved true ultramarine for small, symbolically important passages. The robe of the Virgin, a single sacred object, rather than an entire ceiling. Giotto and Enrico Scrovegni chose to cover the whole chapel in it, turning the room itself into a kind of enclosed sky, a decision that reads, once its cost is understood, as another form of the same argument being made everywhere else in the building, that no expense would be spared in making this particular case for a particular soul's redemption. The pigment has not survived the 7 centuries untouched. Conservators working on the 2002 campaign documented areas where the ultramarine has suffered from a chemical process called sulfation, in which airborne pollutants react with the pigment and the binding medium over time, leaving a whitish haze across passages that would originally have read as a uniform, saturated blue. Some of this damage predates modern industrial pollution entirely, a reminder that fresco, however permanent it is by comparison with other painting techniques, still exists inside a slow chemical conversation with the air around it that never fully stops. The restoration team's technical analysis, drawing on pigment sampling and imaging across the chapel's surfaces, allowed conservators to distinguish original material from centuries of accumulated grime and earlier, cruder restoration attempts, work that had in some places altered the very blue the whole chapel had been built around. This level of consistency implies a degree of advanced planning that had little precedent among Giotto's immediate predecessors, most of whom worked from pattern books, fixed templates of saints and scenes copied and recombined from workshop to workshop with only minor variation. A painter working from a pattern book does not need to solve the problem of how a human body looks from underneath while twisting through the air, because the pattern book was never asked to depict such a thing. Giotto seems to have solved that problem before he ever picked up a trowel to lay the day's plaster, which raises a question the surviving documentary record cannot fully answer. Where had he seen a body rendered that way before? Padua and the surrounding region held visible Roman remains, sarcophagi, relief carvings, and fragments of antique sculpture that had never entirely vanished from the Italian landscape the way they had elsewhere in medieval Europe, and a number of art historians, working from formal comparison rather than any surviving document naming a specific source, have proposed that Giotto studied surviving classical relief directly, adapting the twisting, foreshortened poses of antique funerary sculpture into a devotional Christian scene, decades before the broader rediscovery of antiquity that historians later named the Renaissance. The proposal remains a matter of stylistic inference rather than settled fact. No sketchbook, no workshop notebook, no letter describing Giotto standing before a Roman sarcophagus in Padua or anywhere else has survived, and given how few personal documents from any painter of this period survive at all, none may ever surface. What has survived is the wall itself, and the wall keeps making the same argument the sketchbook would have made, in plaster instead of ink. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The attribution question surrounding Giotto is not confined to Padua. His other major fresco cycle, depicting the life of Saint Francis on the walls of the upper church of the Basilica of San Francesco in Assisi, has carried its own unresolved authorship debate for decades. Traditional accounts, repeated since Vasari's 16th century biography, credit the entire Assisi cycle to Giotto, painted before his work in Padua. Beginning in the final years of the 20th century, a number of specialists challenged that attribution on stylistic grounds, arguing that significant portions of the Assisi frescoes show a hand, or hands, distinct from the one that later worked in the Scrovegni Chapel, and proposing an anonymous painter sometimes referred to in scholarship as the Isaac Master as the true author of at least some of the scenes. The debate has never been fully settled, and current scholarship remains divided, with some historians defending the traditional attribution and others maintaining that Assisi represents a workshop effort in which Giotto's precise contribution cannot be cleanly separated from that of his collaborators. What is not disputed is the Scrovegni Chapel itself. Padua carries none of Assisi's ambiguity, because the Paduan Commission is a single, sealed, privately funded chapel, completed within a short and well-documented span of years, its internal consistency of hand and method offering exactly the kind of unified evidence that Assisi's longer, more collaborative building history does not. The technical audacity mattered because of where it sat inside a larger sequence. The lamentation scene sits partway through a narrative sequence that moves a viewer physically around the chapel, from the joyful early scenes of the Virgin's life at the top of the walls, down through the Passion of Christ toward the Last Judgment on the entrance wall, and the angels twisting in grief above Christ's body function inside that sequence as an argument about what a human response to death and judgment should look like. Byzantine convention, with its frontal, composed, largely emotionless holy figures, had never needed a grieving angel to twist its body in visible anguish, because the theological point of that tradition was the unchanging authority of the sacred figures depicted, not the emotional experience of witnessing their suffering. Giotto's angels claw at their own faces. One tears at its hair. Several are shown mid-scream, mouths open, a detail almost never attempted in the painting of holy figures before this chapel, since an open, distorted mouth was traditionally reserved in religious art for the damned, for demons, for the grotesque rather than the sacred. By giving that same distorted, anguished expression to angels mourning Christ, Giotto collapsed a distinction that centuries of painters before him had carefully maintained, inside a chapel whose entire program exists to make an argument about a specific soul's fate. Enrico Scrovegni commissioned a building whose narrative walks a visitor from the Virgin's joy through Christ's suffering to a final scene of judgment in which Enrico himself kneels, presenting the very structure the visitor is standing inside as an offering. The grieving, contorted angels are not incidental to that argument. They model, in the clearest visual terms available to a painter working in the 1200s, what an appropriate emotional and spiritual response to Christ's death looks like, immediately before the chapel asks its viewer to consider their own judgment on the opposite wall. The technical risk Giotto took with the twisting, foreshortened body served a devotional argument that needed the viewer to feel something specific at that exact point in the sequence, not simply to admire what the painter's hand could do. Contemporary viewers walking into the chapel in the early 1300s would have understood this shift in a way that requires explanation for a modern audience, but would have needed none for Enrico's own guests. They had grown up looking at painted saints whose stillness signified holiness. A painted figure twisting and screaming broke a visual rule they had never seen broken. inside a building whose entire purpose was to make its patron's spiritual argument as persuasive as possible to everyone who saw it. The same logic extends to the illusionistic virtue and vice figures at the base of the walls. A visitor who has just walked past painted stone relief convincing enough to trouble the eye has already been shown, in the chapel's opening minutes, that appearances can carry more weight than they have any right to. The Last Judgment waiting at the far end of the chapel asks that same visitor to take seriously an image of ultimate reckoning rendered by the same hand, using the same command of illusion, and to understand Enrico Scrovegni's own kneeling figure inside that image as an argument he was staking his own soul on. 300 years after the Scrovegni Chapel was finished, Giorgio Vasari would credit Giotto with rescuing Italian painting from what he called the crude manner of the Greeks, and later historians, working with better documentation and less interest in flattering any single genius, have offered a more careful version of the same claim. Giotto did not invent naturalism from nothing, and he was not working in total isolation. Painters in Rome and elsewhere in central Italy had already begun experimenting with weightier, more physically grounded figures in the final decades of the 1200s, and Giotto's own training likely exposed him to some of that experimentation before he ever picked up a brush in Padua. The Scrovegni Chapel stands apart because Giotto pushed an existing trend further, faster, and more completely than anyone working around him, inside a single unified building where the results can still be walked through in sequence today. The art historian John White, in a study of pictorial space that remains a standard reference for the period, described Giotto's achievement in the chapel as a coherent, sustained solution to the problem of representing convincing physical space and weight, one that would not be matched in ambition again until the systematic mathematical perspective developed in Florence more than a century later by Filippo Brunelleschi and codified in writing by Leon Battista Alberti in the 1430s. That later development, true linear perspective, built on geometric proof, is a different achievement from what Giotto accomplished. Giotto's foreshortened angel was not built from a mathematical system of vanishing points and measured orthogonals. It was built from observation, from an intuitive grasp of how a twisting body reads from below, arrived at roughly 120 years before anyone in Florence would sit down and prove, with geometry, why it should look that way. Painters working after Giotto, including Masaccio, whose frescoed Trinity in Florence would apply Brunelleschi's mathematics to sacred space around 1425, inherited a tradition in which physical, weighted, foreshortened bodies belonged inside religious painting because Giotto had already shown, more than a century earlier, that they could carry devotional meaning rather than undermine it. Padua sat closer to the middle of Giotto's career than to its end. He went on to work in Florence, Naples, Milan, and elsewhere, and in 1334 the city of Florence appointed him capomaestro, master of works, for the construction of its new cathedral, a civic honor that placed a painter in charge of an architectural project of the first importance, an appointment that would have been unthinkable for an artist regarded as a mere craftsman, working from inherited patterns. The bell tower that still stands beside the Florence Cathedral today, begun under his direction and still known by his name, was left unfinished at his death in 1337, completed by other hands working from his design. None of that later fame changes what happened first, inside a small brick chapel, built to answer for a dead usurer's reputation, where a painter still in his 30s or early 40s solved, apparently without a safety net, a problem in the representation of the human body that the rest of European painting would spend the next century catching up to. This is what the falling angel above the lamentation actually represents, once the full context surrounding it has been assembled. The falling angel is the visible edge of a decision Giotto made across an entire building, a choice to trade the safety of inherited pattern for the risk of direct observation, one that survived 700 years of candle smoke, war, flooding, and industrial pollution, largely intact, at a moment when almost no one working around him was prepared to take that risk as far as he did, in service of a patron who needed his chapel to make the most persuasive possible argument about grief, judgment, and the chance of redemption. The angel twists because the emotional logic of the scene required a body in genuine anguish rather than a symbol of anguish borrowed from an existing template, and Giotto seems to have decided that only an anatomically convincing, physically extreme pose would carry that weight. Whether he had studied Roman relief sculpture directly, absorbed the innovations of painters working in Rome and Assisi before him, or worked the problem out largely on his own through sustained observation and an unusual confidence in his own hand, remains open. The documentary record that would resolve the question with certainty was never written down, or has not survived if it was. The chapel that holds this angel is small by the standards of the churches and basilicas built around the same period, a single rectangular room roughly the size of a modest hall, and for most of its history it stood open to the street, absorbing centuries of candle smoke, damp Paduan winters, and eventually the exhaust of 20th century motor traffic, passing close enough to leave a visible layer of grime across the frescoed surfaces. The 2002 restoration addressed more than the paint itself. Engineers built a sealed antechamber at the entrance, an airlock through which every visitor now passes and waits for a fixed number of minutes before being allowed into the chapel proper, a mechanism designed to stabilize the humidity and particulate levels inside the small room before a new group of bodies, breath, and body heat is introduced. Visits are timed, rarely more than 20 minutes, and then the group is asked to leave so the next can enter. Whoever stands beneath the twisting angel today does so inside that controlled window, granted just long enough to look up, find the figure among the 9 others surrounding it, and consider what generations of conservators, art historians, and restorers have spent measured decades trying to fully explain. The plaster has held for 700 years. The giornate are still traceable under raking light exactly where Giotto laid them, day after day, without the luxury of revision. The angel still falls, permanently, in a spiral no painter working around Giotto would have attempted, and few painters working a century later would improve on. The technique itself is not in question, visible to anyone standing in the room during their allotted minutes. What remains unresolved is how a painter working within the physical constraints of true fresco, without a documented tradition of foreshortened figures immediately behind him, without the mathematics of linear perspective still more than a century from being written down, arrived at a solution this complete on what appears to have been his first and only attempt. The wall does not answer that question. It simply keeps holding the angel exactly where Giotto placed it, 700 years ago, still falling, still correct. Photographic documentation from the 2002 campaign remains the primary reference conservators consult whenever a new question arises about the fresco's condition. An archive of its own now layered on top of the archive Giotto built into the plaster the first time he laid a giornata against this wall. In 2021, the Scrovegni Chapel was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List as part of a group listing covering 8 fresco cycles across Padua from this same general period, an international recognition that arrived more than 700 years after the chapel's consecration, and roughly 2 decades after the restoration that first mapped its giornate in full. The listing changed nothing about the physical wall. It simply confirmed, through the machinery of a modern international institution, what conservators, art historians, and ordinary visitors standing beneath the falling angel had already been arguing for a very long time. Sensors installed during the 2002 campaign continue to monitor temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide levels inside the chapel in real time, a quiet technological coda to a building whose original decoration was itself an argument about permanence and risk. The instruments exist because the danger to the fresco was never really finished when the restoration ended. It simply changed form, from centuries of candle soot and open windows to the accumulated breath of the thousands of visitors who now pass through the sealed antechamber every year, each one granted a short, carefully measured window in which to stand where Enrico Scrovegni once stood, look up at the same angel he commissioned, and decide for themselves whether the argument the whole building was built to make still holds any weight 700 years later. The chapel keeps no other kind of record. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.